Hello Year 10. Today's lesson focuses on the conflict between ranchers and homesteaders. And just to introduce the key terms. So, the ranchers, they're the men who raise cattle on the open range. The homesteaders, they're the Easterners who had claimed their 160 acres of free land under the Homestead Act and had started small farms out on the Great Plains. And the open range, that's the wide open lands of the Great Plains, not yet settled on or fenced in with barbed wire. So the first thing you need to do is put the title, The Conflict Between Ranchers and Homesteaders, and then just copy down these key terms in the red box. Okay, now we need to explain why the ranchers and the homesteaders increasingly came into conflict in the period of the 1870s, 1880s and 1890s. So when the government gave out land on the Great Plains, it was in a checkerboard style. And you can see that on my diagram to the left, the green-white diagram. So some of it, the green squares, was free public land that the ranchers could use for grazing or could be claimed by homesteaders. The other land, the white squares, was owned by the railway company, and they sold it off to the highest bidder, usually the ranchers. But the ranchers became unhappy when the homesteaders acquired public land, that's the green squares, and when the richer homesteaders bought land from the railway, the white squares. This was usually land with water, and homesteaders fenced off their land with barbed wire. This cut off access to essential water for the ranchers and their cattle. So basically, the conflict between ranchers and homesteaders was a fight over land and who owned it. The ranchers had originally been alone on the Great Plains, so were free to use all the land, but increasingly, as I've just explained, the homesteaders came in and took their 160 acres of free land, that's the green squares, and then the more wealthy homesteaders, the prosperous homesteaders, were able to buy more land, the white squares off the railway, and then they began to fence in their land, and so more and more land was being taken from the ranchers. So this issue of land was the major cause of conflict. However, there were other issues that increased the tension between the cattle ranchers and the homesteaders, increased the conflict. First of all, the ranchers accused homesteaders of cattle rustling, that's stealing cattle, and complained that the barbed wire fences the homesteaders were putting up harmed their animals. And in turn, the homesteaders complained that cattle owned by the cattle ranchers trampled and ate their crops. So that's a source of falling out. And then there were also rancher actions against the homesteaders. So the rising tension led to ranchers and cattle barons using underhand tactics to block the homesteaders. So first of all, cattle barons would get every family member of those working on the ranches to file claims using the Homestead Act to take the best land on the plains and give it to them. So those green squares we talked about on the earlier slide. And as all land was in a checkerboard section, the ranchers would buy land from the railroad companies. They would then fence off the land so that there was no access to public lands. So in this diagram, you can see the R for rancher. So they buy the land on the white squares. They then create a fence to fence off the land. And as you can see from the diagram, in owning the land that's on the white squares, effectively, the ranchers can block off access to the public land, the green squares, and effectively claim that as well. And that's another source of tension. And then also ranchers took homesteaders to court over claims to land. And the ranchers, the cattle barons, had the money to win the case, so the homesteaders gave up. So the cattle ranchers were wealthy, the homesteaders weren't, so they could use the courts to steal more land. And finally, farmers said that ranchers should fence their land to stop cattle eating crops. But ranchers wanted their cattle to roam free. It was not their responsibility. So again, this leads to further conflict. So finally, the task for today. So using the information you've just listened to, and obviously you can read back through it, you need to write a heading in your books. The heading should be the reasons why ranchers and homesteaders came into conflict with one another. You should then write a detailed summary or explanation of the reasons. So you must include an explanation of why there was conflict over land and how access to water also increased that conflict, about cattle rustling, about barbed wire, about damage to crops, about the abuse of the Homestead Act by the ranchers, about fencing off of public land, and about the court. So in short, your paragraph should go through and explore all the reasons that are behind the conflict that's going to emerge between the cattle ranchers who have got to the Great Plains first and the homesteaders who came later to claim their land on the Great Plains.